Okay, hopefully that's visible. Yeah, great.
Yes, we
Okay.
can see it.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so I really was excited to be able to give this presentation, but I must admit, it's wasn't sure where to start. Got basically an hour and a half, and then I'll try to leave as much time as I can at the end for questions. But as my husband says, once my bat switch is turned on, I talk endlessly about bats. So if I do look like I'm going over time, Cindy, please pipe in and say, oh, you have like 20 minutes left. I'm hoping to leave more than that. But anyways, I'm just forewarning you that I have a lot of stuff that I would like to talk to you about. Keep track of your questions, or you could put them in the chat and we'll try to get to those at the end. And I'm going to kind of go all over the board a little bit, but I do have a roadmap that we'll follow so that we can touch on all the main topics that I think would be of interest to a lot of you. First of all, though, I'm going to do a shameless promotion of, oops, now why is that not advancing? Okay, and these things always work in the practice and then don't work after that. All right, let me just start here again. Okay, is that going to advance? Oh, there we go. Okay. Yes, so a little bit of a promotion, but this is also something I think will be of interest to some of you. And that is a book that's coming out in March, which is The Bats of British Columbia. The first version was by Dave Nagorson and Mark Brigham years ago. And so we finally got together, brought on Jared Hobbs with us to help, including photos. And that second edition should be coming out then towards the end of March. And so there's been pre-order going on for a while. I guess there's a couple like Amazon and Indigo are covering it or selling it ahead of time. But that book will have a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today. So what am I going to talk about? Why is this doing this again? I'm sorry, I don't know why. Not advancing. All right, let's see. Okay, I think that's going to work. So yes, we are going to cover quite a bit. As I mentioned, I'm pretty optimistic we can get through most of this, but right at the very end, you'll see that I'm going to talk about WCS Canada's Western Bat Program. And that's really what we're trying to do for conservation management, looking at a lot of our projects. And so we'll just see how much I get through of that, but you can always go to our website if I don't end up talking a lot about that, and we can certainly talk about some of it in the questions if there's time for that. So we're really going to work our way through the species of British Columbia, talk about their basic ecology, physiology, how that influences their behaviors, getting into echolocation, which is a big topic on its own. I typically would teach like a week-long course on bat acoustics and how to use bat detectors and so on. Also, sometimes I'll offer a misnetting course on just like how to inventory for bats. And so I'll cover a tiny bit on some of those tools as well, and mostly talking about threats then and how we can work to conserve and manage our species. So our species are quite diverse, really, in British Columbia. We have, depending on what you qualify as a resident bat species, that's the hard part to decide, but we have roughly 15 species. We did have 16 until about 2019, in which we reclassified one of the species, the Keen's Myotis. So that one you won't find on this list. That's been in previous lists of species for British Columbia bats. You'll also notice moving forward with this book in March that there will be one name change, and that is the Western Small-Footed Myotis will now be called the Dark-Nosed Small-Footed Myotis, which is a mouthful. And unfortunately not based on a lot of evidence as to why that name has changed. So you might be wondering, well, why are we changing it? Largely, we have to kind of come up with a standard. And the standard for naming bats in the world, everybody sort of decided it's batnames.org. Now that's the American Museum of Natural History And so if you go to that website, you can actually find all of the species of bats in the world with their accepted common names. And so that's what we've adopted for this book. And it does have us then changing one of the names. And it has also recognized that Myotis keenii does not exist anymore. The accidentals that occur in British Columbia are really 3 species. The canyon bat, which occurs in Washington, we've got a little bit of evidence of that species now up through the Okanagan. The Mexican or Brazilian freetail bat seems to have come up the coast, and it looks like it's kind of residing in the Vancouver area, kind of that Duncan area. I think we've had some Texada Island recordings, and largely on Salt Spring. And so that one we don't know anything about. In fact, we don't have any physical evidence of that species yet. It's all been acoustic. And then the big pocketed freetail bat is definitely accidental. We only have 2 occurrences of that species. So I'm going to spend most of my time today, when we do talk about specific species, we'll just be talking about the resident species, the ones that are listed on the left. Oh, right. And I forgot these 2 special ones at the bottom. I do like to point out, because they are different from the rest in a number of ways, behavior in particular. So those we call our Lasiurans, because it's Lasiurus borealis and Lasiurus cinereus are the 2 species. And these are the bats that leave for the winter. They essentially are considered migratory. They only use trees, and so they will go south for the winter, whereas the other ones we believe do overwinter in the province. So let's put a face to a name and look at some of these resident species then. So let's start with the pallid bat. The pallid bat is found mostly just in the Okanagan. And I don't have range maps here, but they are, the updated range maps will be in the book. And I'll try and tell you kind of roughly where they are as we go through. So the pallid bat, yeah, like mostly the south part of the Okanagan is where it's restricted to. It typically feeds on what everybody else does, all the other bats in the province, and that is insects, except for the fact that it's unique in that it will actually eat scorpions. And that's because it's a ground dwelling bat. It's very similar to a vampire bat in its foraging habits, where it stays low to the ground, will land on the ground, feed on insects. It has massive ears to listen for sounds being made by its prey, like beetles scurrying across the ground. And most recently, we haven't discovered this in BC yet, but is something we haven't looked for. And that is, in some of its range, they've now discovered that it actually will feed on nectar as well, and will approach flowers, and therefore it picks up pollen. And so they've discovered a lot of pollen and some really cool footage now, this bat actually feeding in flowers. So we're gonna hopefully look for that in the Okanagan. Now, another really interesting species also found in the Okanagan, but also up the Fraser River Valley as far north as Williams Lake, is the spotted bat. Aptly named for the 3 spots on its back. This bat is another very large-eared bat. Whenever these bats have large ears, I'll talk about this more, but it means that they are capable of listening for prey-generated sounds, or they're very good at funneling sounds. And that's the case for this spotted bat. It needs to hear very low frequency sounds, ones that are actually sounds that humans can hear. So this is kind of an unusual bat in that it is actually creating its sounds that are within the range of human hearing. All the other bats, when they're producing sounds to navigate through their environment and find food, they're producing sounds that are typically above what our ears can hear. So the spotted bat roosts in nothing but high cliffs, crevices, and it's considered a high-flying bat pretty much all the time. Another very big-eared bat is the Townsends Bigger Bat. This one is found across southern BC. It's very patchy. Where it does occur, you can usually find it in mines and sometimes in abandoned buildings. And this species then is one of the unusual ones in that it's got a very interesting shape to its nose. And because of that, it has a unique characteristic of its echolocation sounds, the sounds that it's producing while it's navigating or looking for prey. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now the big brown bat, some people find it very confusing now when we start to talk about the brown bats, because there's a lot of brown bats in the province. This is the biggest one, if you will, the big brown bat, and it is a generalist in that it's found basically across the province, although we do not have a good understanding of it in the north. There's a lot of places that it doesn't seem to be found, but it's not well inventoried in the north. We associate this bat with being able to roost in buildings, bat boxes, but it also roosts in trees and rock crevices and so on. Now the rest of the brown bats, sometimes we like to lump them together, little brown jobs, as they do in the bird world. We've definitely got a lot of these. We've got 8 species of these Myotis bats. So I'll just walk you through them. We won't go into too much on them, but I'll try and say a little bit about each. So the northern Myotis is largely found only in the north of British Columbia, except it does come down as far as Revelstoke, even a little further south into the North Kootenay Lake area in the east. We don't have a good understanding of its distribution in that southeast part of the province. So it is federally endangered, which is why I've got it in red here. This species is considered an Eastern North American species, and in the West, it really only occurs in the northern region of Alberta and BC and into Yukon Northwest Territories. It is being hit very hard by white nose syndrome. In fact, at this point, it's considered the species that's been hit the hardest, and is therefore also listed in the US as it is in Canada. I should say the northern Myotis is also considered an old growth tree specialist. The little brown Myotis is very common. It used to be the most common species across all of North America. Now in the east, it's extirpated from some areas, making a comeback in some of its sites, and that's because of white nose syndrome having caused mass mortality of this species. It's typically found in buildings, especially the females. If there's a building to be had, they're usually roosting in large groups, a couple hundred in buildings or bat boxes. And this species is still relatively common. In fact, it's at this point where white nose has not impacted bats, this bat is still commonly found, but it is listed as endangered, likely to experience mass die-off as white nose continues to spread. And I will be talking about white nose syndrome at towards the end. Okay, the long-eared Myotis, Myotis evotis, is a species that's considered only a Western species. It is not found in Eastern North America, and it has quite large ears. Whenever you see bats with large ears, you start to think about the fact that they do something different than bats with small ears. Bats with large ears forage differently. They're often listening for sounds that prey are making, like scurrying of beetles or moth flapping their wings, that sort of thing. So you can actually start to look at morphology and try to understand species ecology just based on features that they have about their bodies. So I will end up talking more about long-eared bats eventually, but for now, let's just leave it at that. The long-legged Myotis is a species with fairly small ears. They are found kind of across the province as well, but we just do not have a good sense of the distribution of the species. It's widespread, but it's not really common anywhere in particular. It's not like we run into large groups of them. They can occasionally roost in buildings, but they do roost in trees and rocks mostly. The Yuma Myotis is, at this point, probably our most common bat in BC. It's a Western species only. It roosts in large colonies, as in thousands of bats. So they will often appear in mixed colonies with little brown. They will be in the same bat box even sometimes, but they're very different species in terms of genetics, not even closely related. And they don't snuggle with each other. They can be in the same bat box, but they're not tucked in next to each other. They'll often keep into different chambers or different sides of the box. Same thing in attics. Sometimes there'll be one end of the attic is little brown, the other end is Yuma. So it looks like they're using these same roosts because they have the same ecological requirements and the same roost choice, they also have the same foraging ecology. So they will be out feeding in the same places that little browns do. In fact, those two species we call water skimmers. Little brown and Yuma myotis like to spend a lot of time just foraging right above the surface of the water, just inches above. And that's unique to those two species. So when you see a bunch of bats that are just really kind of flying directly above the water for long distances and long periods of time, it's either the Yuma myotis or the little brown. They're so identical then. In morphology, they look the same. Ecology, they're pretty much the same, at least in the summer. We don't know their wintering ecology. And to be able to compare them at this point, then we kind of lump them together and say, we think these bats are basically the same, which means that if little brown myotis is being killed in large numbers by white-nosed Yuma, is probably going to experience the same mortality levels. So far, that has been the case in the West, which is only in Washington. But this species then, to tell it from little brown, it's very difficult. You can either use acoustics, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but otherwise you're kind of stuck using genetics. So it's something that's often we say Yuma or little brown if we can't tell them apart. California myotis is a very small bat. It might actually be kind of our smallest bat in the province, depending on what area of the province you're in. It's found amongst clutter in trees. They like to roost in trees. They will roost in rock in the winter, and they're extremely small, so they're very maneuverable, and they fly around within trees. And you're pretty much going to find those all over the province in the south and a little bit into the central area. We don't know exactly how far north the Yuma or the California myotis go. The fringed myotis, another LBJ, you can tell it apart from a really stiff fringe of hair that occurs along the tail membrane. And I guess I'll just talk about the dark-nosed small-footed myotis in that these two species are very dry ecosystem dwelling species. So we find them in the Okanagan, up the Fraser River Valley. And we do have the fringed myotis also in the Creston area, and we just recently detected it acoustically in the kind of Cranbrook area, where again it's dry ponderosa pine. The small-nosed, dark-nosed, small-footed myotis, still getting used to that new name. It is also found in the Okanagan and up the Fraser River Valley. We think we have recorded some of it in the south part of the Kootenays, the east and the west, but we would require capture to know if we definitely have that species. Okay, and moving into sort of these last three unique species in a large way, the silver-haired bat, Lasionyctus noctivagans, is an interesting species because it's typically considered across North America to be migratory. So it should move south for the winter. That doesn't seem to be the case in British Columbia, though. If there are migrations, they seem to be short, or they seem to be largely female migrations and not males. So I've done a lot of work on this species in the West Kootenay, finding it hibernating in mines and rock crevices and trees. So through bands, I've been able to tell that these bats, especially the males, seem to just stay put at in the same area, using the same roosts in many cases year round. And finally, the two Lasiurans, the eastern red bat and the hoary bat. Now, if you've got a copy of the old BC bat book, it will say that the red bat was the western red bat, and that's the Lasiurus blossivillii, but that's in fact not correct. And we found that out quite a few years ago now, when the first red bat was killed by wind turbines up in the Dawson Creek area. And at that point, it was genetically determined that we do actually have eastern red bat in the province, and we've never had western red bat. It was actually sort of a museum labeling error that occurred through some taxonomic name changes. They roost just in trees, and same with the hoary bat. So these Lasiurans roost in foliage. Okay, they're not roosting up under bark, and they're not going into buildings, they're not going to rock crevices. They just roost in clumps of leaves. And you can tell that they are equipped for that because they both got very hairy tail membranes, which means if they start to get a little chilly, they will use that as a blanket and wrap that around themselves and stay warm. And they do that when they migrate south for the winter. They will use that blanket, their tail membrane, and the red bats in particular will tuck in as little balls, fuzzy little balls, into leaf litter, and let some of the snow insulate them for periods of time. If they have to go for a few weeks at a time without food, that's how they do it. Okay, so as our only flying mammal then, the order Chiroptera means hand wing. There's a lot of species of bats in the world, and you do want to sort of get to know their anatomy a little bit, because this is important to be able to tell the species apart. So the hand wing part just means their wing is all the same bones as what we'd have in our hand, or actually our arm. So you can see here we've got the elbow up to the wrist, and then all the fingers coming off of the wrist. The skin encompasses all of the wing bones, and then continues all the way down to the tail encompassing the leg. And this very large membrane then is used for flight and for also capture of insects. That's the tail membrane, or the wing can be used to scoop an insect. And when they give birth, the pup is captured in that tail membrane, because they do give birth with head up. Although typically when they're roosting during the day, then they would have their head down. You notice a little thing called the keel. That is a little flap of skin that appears on some of the bats and not all. And those little brown jobbies, the myotis, that's a really important thing to look for to see if they have a keel or not. And that can help you identify which species you're looking at. This is just a picture directly from the book. This is Jared Hobbs' photo. Some of the photos I'll show today are Jared's, and he's here captured a pallid bat that's just coming down for a drink, and you can see a lot of the unique morphological features here of bats, including this thing up here in the ear called a tragus. So the tragus is a tiny little leaf projection at the base of the ear that's really important for echolocation. So if bats echolocate, they've got that. Not all bats in the world do echolocate. The ones that do will have this tragus, and that's used for receiving the echoes. And as I pointed out already, there's the keel, which is right next to the foot. That's also very important. The other things you look for that are important for identifying morphology are things like measuring legs for the long-legged bat, measuring that tragus length, measuring the foot and the form especially, and looking for diagnostic features like the fringe of hair on the fringed myotis that runs across the tail membrane. Okay, so talking about morphology then really is important, because not only does it allow us to tell the species apart, but it starts to tell us a lot about their ecology, where they fly, how far they fly. It's all based on the morphology of their bodies. So for example, you look at the body size in relation to the wing size determines, you can just look at a bat without knowing anything about it and try to, tell whether it's a slow bat or a fast flying bat. And you can do that by looking at the size of the bat in relation to their wing area. And you can also look at the shape of the wings. If they're long and narrow, they're very aerodynamic. If they're sort of short and fat, they're going to be very maneuverable to go in and around vegetation, for example, in a forest. Now, where and how they roost, that is determined also a lot by their morphology, because it'll determine if they're able to roost on the ground, like under boulders, like something like a western small-footed wood, which is what we now call the dark-nosed small-footed myotis. They will roost right on the ground because they're very maneuverable and they can just take off from the ground. Same with pallid bats. They can roost very low to the ground because they're very strong and they can just jump off the ground and start flying. Many other bats can't do that. Many bats have to actually climb up and then take flight by dropping. And so they need to roost in high up areas. So they will be roosting up in trees or cliffs, for example. Their size and the shape of their body and the shape of their ears, all of that controls their echolocation as well, and the way they forage. So understanding how echolocation relates to body size it allows you to understand the kind of what we call the ecology of echolocation. So a big bat is going to typically produce lower frequency calls, which means it can actually only find larger prey, or it's going to be targeting larger prey items. And that's an interesting connection, because it means that you can actually figure out what bats might be eating in an area just by seeing the acoustic calls that they're producing. So some of the other things about morphology. There's obviously going to be trends across ranges for these species, and especially those that are not moving around a lot. If they're just breeding locally, then you're going to start to see more and more local adaptations. And that is something we see particularly in British Columbia, less so in Eastern Canada, where we get bats moving around more. But here in British Columbia, a lot of the bats don't necessarily undergo long distance migrations. And so we are seeing changes in their morphology, and especially their forearm length or ear lengths across the province. This is just one example that works for the Keen's Myotis, which is now called just part of the Longeared Myotis, which is Myotis evotis. When we looked at the forearm lengths and the ear lengths across latitude and longitude, we saw a distinct pattern. And what might have caused the initial definition of Keenii was the fact that when that species was defined originally, they looked at specimens that were on kind of each end of the spectrum, the smaller animals and the larger animals. And so that played into this idea that maybe there was this different species. But when we did a more thorough sampling of across the range of Myotis keenii, which was really just in Washington and British Columbia along the coast, it became evident that this was a cline. And we have since looked at the genetics and determined that they're one breeding population. And that's why the Myotis keens disappeared. And now we just consider it all to be one species, Myotis evotis. California Myotis is the same way. As you go towards the east, the forearms are larger. Same thing with little browns. As you go north, the forearms are larger. And in fact, most of the time, male bats tend to be smaller than females. But as you get further north, the difference between the species is less and less. So just something to be aware of, that there's this cline in a lot of these species. And so, you know, when you're using forearm to tell bats apart, you have to recognize that there's going to be quite a range, and that could vary depending on where you are in the province. Okay, so what is a bat? I actually feel that we do bats a big disservice by calling them bats. We don't say ungulate or hoofed mammal. We tend to say like elk or deer or horse. You know, we really differentiate those by name, but we don't do that with bats. And I mean, sure, there's lots of reasons that we don't, but I think because we don't, it's a big disservice to them, because we tend to think of a bat as a bat. And what's the ecology of a bat? Well, the ecology of a bat is like asking what's the ecology of hoofed mammals. So they are very different. They have different roosting needs. They have different foraging needs. And you can tell when you start to look at the morphology that they're going to be different. So for example, a big-eared bat on the left, that's a Townsends Bigger Bat, versus a hoary bat on the right. Different ear lengths. That's going to tell you that they're feeding differently. They're foraging differently. The hoary bat with the small ears is going to be foraging out in the open, looking for insects flying around, whereas the one on the left, the Townsends, because it's got those big ears, is going to cue in on insects that are literally sitting on vegetation, and they could hover and pick the insects off of vegetation. That's what those big ears allow them to do, and that's called gleaning. So the other thing you would look at is, you know, the hairy tail membrane. Well, it's hairy on the big brown, or on the hoary bat, because they roost in trees and they're out in the open, and they have no way to really contain heat or moisture other than to wrap themselves up in a blanket. Whereas the Townsends Bigger Bat, for example, doesn't have that tail membrane that's hairy, because it goes and tucks into crevices, into mines. It will even occasionally go into trees or buildings. And so it can tuck into little spots to help conserve its heat and moisture. So these are just some of the things you would be looking for when you look at morphology, and why I try to stress then that a bat is not a bat. And I should also say that diets across the world vary. And so as we start to look at what is a bat, when you're talking about 1,400 species, it's even broader because they are feeding on a lot of other things other than insects. So where do bats forage and how they forage? Again, this is very much dictated by the body size and their ears. And I did mention the word gleaner versus hawkers, and this is just showing you that terminology there. So a gleaner is a bat that will pick insects or can pick insects off of vegetation or even off the ground, and they will need big ears to do that, and long ears, because even though all these bats produce sound, ultrasound or just sound to echolocate, they don't always depend on that. And the gleaners can actually listen for sounds coming from the insects themselves. And aerial hawkers, ones that are going to have small ears and they're going to be out flying around looking for prey just out in the open, they will not be able to hear the prey generated sounds. And so they're not depending on those for their foraging. But typically they're very fast flying, strong bats too, and they can cover a large area in the night. And so they can be out looking for insects all over the place. So where to find a bat in the day? Bats hide, they should be. Even the tree roosting bats are hiding amongst foliage. So you can look for signs of bats, and that's their guano. So you can find bats potentially under bridges. Again, you could look for guano in attics, even in caves or mines. You can go look for them in the day and find them typically by looking for their guano, especially if they are in large groups. Now, solitary bats, which there are many species that literally just roost alone or in very small numbers, you're going to be less likely to find because they're not going to leave these big signature piles of guano. What is bat guano? Well, you can see there next to the quarter. It's small and it looks very much like mouse poo. It is easily differentiated if you're willing to crush it, because you can see here when you crush bat guano, it's very easy to crush. It just literally becomes powdered like this, and it's often very shiny. And it's shiny because it's insect carapace that you're seeing. Now, if the bat's been feeding mostly on moths, it will look kind of dusty because of all the moth scales. That's very different than mouse poo, which will generally not crush. It's going to be like little pieces of cement because they're eating vegetation. The other way you can tell mouse from bat is typically mouse poo is going to obviously be on a flat surface, whereas bat guano, you can find it on like surfaces of walls or up under bridges on the concrete girders. And that's, again, a sign that it's bat, obviously, if it's up on a vertical surface. Now, where to find a bat at night? So bats should be moving around at night feeding, as long as it's a warm enough night and we're in the summer. So they are going to zero in on places where they can get a drink. That's the first thing they're going to do. They come out of a roost, they're pretty much always going to go to water. Now, bats cannot drink from any source of water because they don't land. They drink on the wing. So they need a big enough body of water for their body shape. If they're a small bat, they're very maneuverable. No problem. They could even drink out of a mud puddle. And so those are some of our Myotis species that will literally come in and drink at a mud puddle. But the larger bats, they don't have that maneuverability, and they would need a much larger open body of water. And it can't be wavy, can't be full of rapids. They need something very calm and not full of emergent vegetation. So it's actually quite limiting. Water can be in a lot of areas. Even wetlands, if there's a lot of emergent vegetation, it might be a great place to eat, but not a good place to necessarily get water for many species. I should mention the reason that the water can't be moving is because obviously it would dunk them under if it was moving and it splashed on them. They are good swimmers, but they would have to get out to the edge and try to crawl up something, dry out and get enough height to regain flight. So that's pretty tricky. But the other reason that they don't like to be over top of running water or bubbling water is because running water gives off a lot of ultrasound, and that will basically deafen them. They won't be able to tell their own echoes from the sounds that are being generated by the water itself. You can find them potentially under night roosts. So some species, especially ones that are social, like to be in large groups, like the Myotis or the little brown, or even the big browns, they will go into these areas at night, probably as a social way to gather, but also as a way to keep each other warm while they digest. And that's because a lot of those bats, they don't have the really big ears. So once the insects have settled down in the middle of the night onto the vegetation, they're done feeding. So they just go hang out and digest. Whereas the big-eared bats or the long-eared bats have that advantage of being able to glean. So they can keep foraging all night. They'll just now move down to where the insects are on the vegetation and continue to feed. And so you won't typically find the long or big-eared bats in the middle of the night, night roosting like you will the other bats. And so bridges are a good place that are typically night roosts. Mines are another one in the province. Now, if you're going to try to capture them or put out a bat detector to record them, you're going to be looking for things that are basically linear edges, something that they can follow. Bats like to follow edges. So river valleys or cliff edges, along clear-cut edges, hedgerows, even streets. There have been some studies where bats have literally been found to turn at intersections when they're being tracked with transmitters. So it's really interesting that these bats are cueing in on landscape features and following these edges. And so that's a really good way to know how you can target them. Where do they forage? So this is all over the board as to where bats forage, because again, it depends on their morphology, their shape. If they're a shape of a bat, let's say they've got, you know, the small size, the maneuverable wings, the long ears, they're tucked into vegetation and they're mostly foraging in around branches, even in the forest. So Northern Myotis is an example of a bat that pretty much just stays in the forest. California Myotis will come out, but they really love to be in the forest because they're well adapted for maneuvering around. So to find some of those species, you've got to go into the trees and set your nets, and that's because that's where they're feeding. Others, the bigger bats especially, are outside of the forest. They're out in the open areas, and those you can target them by trying to set up mist nets or put your detectors in areas where they would be kind of moving by, so along those linear edges. Wetlands then in particular are typically good for bats because they're going to have a lot of food for them to eat and possibly some good drinking locations as well. But just know that not all species will necessarily be at wetlands. You might have to get into sort of the upland forested area around those wetlands to recognize all of the species that are in the area. So what species are where then depends on a number of things, as I've said, and also what sex. So this can vary largely in the summer because males and females have very different roles in the summer. The females are trying to produce a pup and the males are basically just hanging out until they need to produce sperm and start mating in the fall. So they're going to choose very different roosts, and I'll try and get into that a little bit when we talk about bat boxes. Day roosts, winter roosts, night roosts, there's different types of roosts then that different species use, and you would go target those depending what type of species you're looking for. So I've sort of mentioned already then the urban versus not urban. That's the other thing. I did talk about species that like to be in buildings and bat boxes, and majority of them don't. So an urban environment is going to typically have a lower diversity of bats unless there's a lot of green space with a lot of other roost options, specifically trees and ideally some rock as well. Street lights too. Some people will see bats in street lights, but there are only certain species that like to do that. Like Myotis typically shies away from lights, whereas little brown likes lights, and they will feed in the street lights. And then that forest versus open that I've already mentioned. Okay, things that it depends on then. So it depends on the drinking needs, as I mentioned, big bodies or small bodies of water, foraging needs. What type of insects are they capable of finding? For example, can they feed on spiders? Well, if it's a gleaning bat, yeah. And in fact, as you go further north in BC into the Yukon, bats are feeding a lot on spiders. And that's mostly because of the cool spring conditions and the short foraging season they have. As you go further north, they pretty much have to take advantage of spiders. And so that restricts the diversity of species in the north, which is probably going to change with climate change. Of course, it does depend on the roosting needs, as I mentioned, and the reproductive needs. And these are the things I haven't really got into yet, but I will next. And just consider other factors like elevation. So here in British Columbia, obviously, we've got huge variation in elevation. The females are typically down low, having their young down low in the valleys, and the males will hang up higher. They hang up higher in the elevation because they like cooler roosts, and I'll explain that a little bit next. But just know that typically the females are down low, the males would gravitate to being up high. One species like the Longeared Myotis, Myotis evotis, is a little bit unusual in that they will have young up at higher elevations than other species. Latitude, as I mentioned, as you go further north, foraging window is much smaller at night, short nights, and the growing season is shorter as well. So that requires some adaptations of northern bats, and that's something I won't get into a ton in here, but there's some interesting stuff that we've been looking at for morphology of different ears and so on as we go further north. Okay, and then the landscape features that I mentioned that bats will follow. So bats break all the rules. This is what got me interested in them in the first place. They are a case-selected species, and really that means that they're more like large mammals, like a grizzly bear, for example. They are long-lived and they don't have a lot of young. Very unusual for their size. In fact, these bats are the longest lived of the small mammals and the slowest reproducing of small mammals. They can live 20, 30, 40 years. We've got evidence of banded little browns over in Alberta, banding that happened back in the 70s that allowed Alberta environment to determine that one of the little browns that they had in a cave over there was at least 38 years old. That bat was just, finally, they stopped seeing it a few years ago, unfortunately. But it was going back to the same cave year after year to hibernate. They do go back. The fidelity is high. So bats go back to the same roosts, typically year after year, especially the females, going back to the roosts that they were born in or staying within that home range. And you just see here that the pup that is nursing, they do typically have one young. The Laziurns are the only ones that will have typically more than that. They can even have up to 4 young, but all the other species are usually just one young, especially here in the West. Okay, now moving into physiology. So the physiology is where things get really interesting, because not only is morphology important for understanding the ecology of these bats, but the physiology is absolutely critical. And this is the part that one really needs to understand to try and provide guidance on roosts. So what do we do more and more as we need to enhance or restore roosts? We need to understand the physiological challenges that bats face in order to properly provide guidance. And so what is most important to remember is that bats just barely make a living. They walk a real energy tightrope. They are flying, which is energetically expensive, and the food that they feed on, insects, is just not rich in energy. They have very small bodies and very large wings, so they have this high surface area to volume ratio, which means they lose heat and moisture really quickly, more so than any other small mammals. And they can't carry very much fat at any one point because they have to fly. So they've got challenges that no other mammals have, and in a way they should not exist, because they would actually, if they kept a mammalian temperature like us, for example, and most other mammals, they would simply not be able to feed themselves enough. They would have to feed round the clock. And of course, they can't do that. So they use thermoregulation. And in particular, then they use what's called torpor. So they thermoregulate by cooling their bodies. And so this is the cool thing about bats, is that they can do this. But there are a lot of challenges with this, and that is if you let your body go cool, there's certain things that the body can no longer do. And so even though torpor is what's allowed bats to evolve and flourish, there have been a lot of trade-offs, and that shows then in the way they choose roosts, for example, and the way they forage. So understanding what torpor is, if you don't know, I mean, I've got a picture of a snake here. It doesn't mean bats are snakes, but they do have a lot of similarities with reptiles in that they can take on the temperature of their surroundings. So to save energy, cells need to be cool. And to do that, then they can literally suspend their metabolic heat production and allow the cells to save energy, not requiring energy, not requiring fat be used, and just go into a kind of a cold state. Now, that means that they need to choose an appropriate ambient temperature. If they're going to just abandon keeping their own body warm and just take on whatever the temperature of their surroundings are, they need to make sure that they're in the right temperature to be able to do what they need to do. And I'll get into what some of those things are next. But know that this is most important when the insect abundance is low. So in the spring, for example, bats have a completely different roost selection usually than they do in the summer. And that's because early in the spring, food is scarce and they need to be able to save energy. So they might go for days and days tucked into a place that's quite cool and just let their bodies go cold. And during that time, then they're saving a ton of energy. They will come out and start feeding on some insects as those insects become available and the spring temperature starts to warm up. But there are problems with being cold. There's very little food digestion going on if the bat is really cold and deep torpor. They don't produce milk. They can't basically produce a fetus. So they will have made it actually back in the fall. And they will have stored the sperm over the winter. Then come spring, they will ovulate, and then kind of the winning sperm will fertilize the egg. From that point on, the gestation period starts, but that gestation period could be extremely long if it's a cold spring and there's not a lot of food. It could be very short if it's a warm spring and there's lots of food. Because if the bats have to go into torpor a lot to save energy and keep their bodies cold, then that fetus is not developing. The cold body also for males doesn't produce sperm, so that's something that they have to deal with when it's time to produce sperm. They have to get their bodies warm. A cold body does not fly away from danger, so this is a problem bats have to hide, because most of the time, especially in the spring and especially for males and during hibernation, their bodies are cold, and so they wouldn't be able to get out of the way of a predator. So that is obviously a huge risk. And cold bodies don't grow, and that's important for pups. So again, if mom has chosen a roost that's quite cold, then that pup is going to grow very slowly, and there's less of a chance that that pup will make it through its first winter, because it will be behind the 8 ball essentially for getting big enough and fat enough in time for its first overwinter. So 2 ways to keep the body warm then. A female in particular, she's got to grow a pup. So she does need to keep her body warm to make sure she can complete the fetal development, nurse the pup, and then have that pup grow. So she's got to choose places then that are going to be warm, okay, or she's got to burn body fat to do it. So those are her 2 options. Now, burning body fat then, like I said, isn't a great option. The more fat she has to burn, the less milk she will have for her pup. But she can go hang out in a really hot roost or fairly hot roost keep her body hot using the heat of her surroundings and not have to burn her own fat to do so. And that is why we tend to think of bats as picking warm roosts. Roosts that they like are things that are like facing the sun, like bat boxes that are in the sun, or rock crevices that are getting good solar exposure during the day, or snags that are sort of out in the open with some good sun exposure. They're going to be females you're going to find in those roosts. The females are the ones that like the sun because they're the ones that have these limitations that require they try to not go cold and not use large amounts of torpor. So the question then becomes, to use torpor or not to use torpor, what should they do? Of course, it does depend then on what stage of reproduction they're in and if they're a male or a female. If they're a female, they're going to have to use torpor a lot less than a male would. So just as a summary, and for those of you who've seen any of my webinars on bat boxes, use of bat boxes, I do go into a little bit there as well. I won't go into it quite as much here. I'm just going to sort of hit on the key topics. But if you want to know more about this, I do have some webinars on YouTube that describe this. But just in general, males are going to typically choose those cool roosts until it's time to make sperm. And then they're going to have to figure out a way to keep their bodies warm. And a lot of times this is to cluster with other males. So we will see this in British Columbia in late July or into August. The males will actually sometimes cluster in these mines or caves. And they're the thought is that they're keeping each other warm enough that they can make sperm. The females, as I said, very different. In the spring, they're probably going to have to choose some cool roosts just because there's going to be very little food. But the idea is to try to get somewhere warm as fast as they can so that they can get that fetus developing. And so this is where having like bat boxes, for example, in the spring that are nice and warm. In fact, some of the experiments people have been doing have been heating bat boxes and actually generating with a heat coil for spring so that these bats returning from hibernation can get into warm boxes. And that's actually been quite successful. The bats do seem to zero in on those. But definitely by summer, they've got warm roosts available to them. In fact, nowadays with our heat waves, those roosts are sometimes getting too hot. And I'll mention that a little bit in a few minutes as well. The goal here, though, is to raise their pup in a warm roost. And then by the end of summer, when they're done, they no longer have to produce milk. They will go off and roost somewhere cooler so that they can use torpor, save a ton of energy, start putting on that fat again for winter. The pups, they might stay back in that hot maternity roost, maybe that attic or bat box for longer until they've grown big enough where they can then start to put on fat. And then they too may move off to some cooler roosts. Now, what can they do to help this process? Well, it's very behavioral. So it's physiological, but it's also behavioral because they can choose these roosts very strategically. And they can do things like passive rewarming, where they would actually pick a roost that will warm up as the day goes on and get them really nice and hot, ready to emerge at night and be active to fly. And finally, the pups, as I've sort of already mentioned then, their goal is really just to try to stay in a warm place so that they can continue to grow. So the take-home message is thermal properties of roosts are everything. They allow reproduction. They allow bats to make a living. Now, I did mention the passive rewarming idea then. So these are the behavioral adaptations that bats can have. They will strategically choose like the side of the house they roost on, for example. They have other behavioral adaptations, including night roosting, where they can go somewhere to digest, or they can go back to nurse their young, or they can keep foraging. There are certain behavioral differences among species and among the sexes, and it depends on the time of year and the reproductive status. I already mentioned latitudinal influences going north. That also applies in elevation, actually. And then the different foraging styles. So all of these things are behavioral, but they all stem from physiological or morphological differences. Excuse me. And the final behavioral adaptation that I was going to mention is just this migrate versus hibernate. If they are going to migrate, then they don't have to deal with finding hibernation sites like most of our species, at least 14 of them we think hibernate in the province. And so then they need to choose appropriate roosts for the winter as well. And there are energy challenges associated then with this hibernation because they can only store so much fat and still fly. And they've got a problem with, having these huge wings and dehydration. Fat is what they've got to feed on. They don't typically have food available to them in the winter. And even if they do, it doesn't look like they would necessarily be feeding in British Columbia. In certain areas, as you go further south into the States, it has been shown that bats will feed in the winter if there's opportunistic food supplies. They need to also, they've got an issue with their muscles potentially because they need to make sure that by the end of winter, they can still fly. And the other problem they have in the middle of winter is that because they're in this deep torpid state and their bodies are so cold, their immune system is literally shut down. And this is, why things like white nose syndrome, which many of you probably already know a little bit about, it kills bats in the winter because it's a fungus that's attacking them while they're torpid and their bodies are cold. And so they need to warm up their body to jumpstart their immune system. And this ultimately could be the reason that some of these bats succumb to white nose syndrome, because they keep warming up and eating through their fat supply. So a lot of what we know about winter is unfortunately still a big mystery. And this is not just for British Columbia. This is kind of across the West. We know a little bit more definitely about bats in the East, where they've been studied for decades. But here in the West, we just don't know a lot about them. What we do know is they tend to fly. We tend to record a lot of bats flying around in winter, even at crazy cold temperatures, minus 10, even up to minus 14 or down to minus 14. So there's a lot we don't understand about why they're doing what they do. We started up a bat caver program a number of years ago to try to just get a sense of where are the bats. We got a lot of caves in this province and over in Alberta, and could we find where the bats are hibernating? But our overall conclusion from that was really that we just don't see bats roosting in large numbers in most of our caves. In fact, in some caves, it seems like there's basically no bats. That's not the case in Alberta and Northwest Territories, where we do find some fairly large clusters, but in terms of like hundreds, up to about 3,000 is the largest. Here in BC, it seems like they're scattered, and we don't know where most of the species necessarily are. We have found 4 significant hibernacula. They're all, 3 of them are actually, I guess, in the West Kootenay, one's over in the Boundary area. They're all in mines, and they're mostly the California Myotis, the Townsends Bigger Bat, and the silver-haired. Those are the main species that we're finding. We do find some places where big browns are and a scattering of other species, but mostly it's those. In Alberta and Northwest Territories, there's actually, I should have increases. There's actually a few more that have been found, but there's not a lot. Like we're talking about half a dozen, a little bit more than that for caves that they know of that have bats. And most of the other places that we know bats hibernate are in rock crevices. And I have found some of those in southern Alberta and here in British Columbia. We have no record of bats using trees in Alberta. We certainly do in BC. And just an interesting little note is that little brown hibernacula, little browns are endangered, and we consider their overwintering areas to be critical habitat based on their SARA listing, but we don't actually have any real confirmed hibernacula known in the province, which is interesting and hopefully something we can continue to look for. Okay, just a few interesting observations in winter. We have found mixed species clusters. This one is fairly common. The silver-haired and the California Myotis will actually cluster together in the winter when things get really cold. Over in Alberta and here in BC, but I'm just showing an Alberta picture, we found bats that are just in these river valleys tucked in down below the frost line. So they're getting into nooks and crannies and crevices, and then they come out in the middle of winter and fly. It varies, but in some places, in some species, it could be every week. Otherwise, it's every like 6 to 8 weeks. Yeah, and that's just Alberta again. And we do know that winter roosts include these crevices. They include buildings. They include, well, that's just more crevices there by different species. We've got Myotis and big brown silver-haired California. And then finally, the one that is kind of the most fascinating is the use of trees, which I think we do not understand well enough what bats are doing in the winter for tree use in this province. We do have one study going on right now in collaboration with UNBC here in the West Kootenay, where we're tracking silver-haired bats. Emily DeFreitas is finding them using, you can actually see a little telemetry and radio transmitter antenna. It's very subtle, poking out this hole. So these large snags, ponderosa pine in particular, she's found them using these in the winter, even at temperatures of -20. These bats are hibernating in trees. It's been tough to find where bats hibernate. We can use radio telemetry. So that's a little transmitter that's glued onto a bat. We've been trying to track them with airplanes. We put up detectors in the winter. We are recording bats in winter. And we're finding a variety of different types of roosts, but it's tricky. These are really, I think that's why we don't know much about bats in the winter right now. One thing I should add is that Alaska Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game, they've been doing quite a bit of tracking of their bats, the little browns in particular. And even though we've had no success finding little browns in BC, they have found them using root wads in Southeast Alaska. So they're tucking into the spaces in around roots on the coast there and in sort of talus slopes. So that's really interesting and maybe opens up some potential for them doing that here in British Columbia as well, especially along the coast. This is just one Myotis I had tracked about 6,000 feet up under a boulder. This was in early November. This might be the sort of thing they're using to hibernate, but we just don't know. It's hard to follow these bats. We know that transmitter is under there, but did the bats stay under there? These transmitters do peel off. They're just glued on. Overall, I can just tell you that line, kind of this imaginary line that I've drawn about 3/4 of the way up BC, seems to define an area north of which we've not detected bats flying in winter, but south of that we do. So even at cold temperatures, even some of these areas that you wouldn't necessarily expect the activity of bats to be in winter, we have detected them flying in winter. And there's so many things that we do not understand why they would fly in winter. The species that we do have, that we have detected are the ones listed there on the left. And then Alberta, we've had basically the same species, just a smaller selection of them. Yeah, we just don't know. And the reason that they're flying then could be so many things. So we've got all these mammalian small mammal hibernators, they all arouse in the middle of winter. Sometimes it's to sleep, because hibernation is not really sleep. Sometimes it's to feed, to drink, to urinate. There's lots of different reasons. Bats are the only kind of weird exception that they seem to expend this great amount of energy to fly. And we don't know why. There's been many reasons that have been proposed. I have tried to test a number of those with students. One in particular, we were trying to understand whether bats are maybe feeding in the winter, especially here in British Columbia, where we have hibernating insects in some of our mines. And we do have bats flying in and out of mines throughout the winter, and maybe they're feeding on those insects. So we laid some plastic in some mines for a few winters, and we're collecting fresh guano in January and thought, yeah, we discovered it. Okay, they must be flying because they are feeding. We got the genetics done on those pellets, and it turns out, no, they're not actually feeding winter. It looks like they're just, by flying, they've warmed their bodies up, they are digesting, and now they're pooping. And so we're collecting guano of insects they'd actually eaten prior to hibernation. And so we still have no evidence they're actually feeding, but they are flying. And I don't have time in this talk to really get into why that might be. There's a lot of other hypotheses that we have, but it's one of those pretty much still a mystery as to what's going on. So shifting into echolocation then. So we've spent a lot of time on morphology and physiology, ecology. The other thing that ties in really well to this whole picture, of course, is echolocation. So they need to fly around and locate their food, and they do that largely through echolocation. So they are listening for the reflections of their sound that they produce to locate where they are in the environment and to also find their food. Now, I just need to give you a quick overview of ultrasound so that it all makes sense as to why bats do what they do. So sound is a wave. I go into this in a lot more of my courses. Unfortunately, there's a lot of kind of physics behind this, but the take-home message here is really the size of the wave, the sound wave that bats produce, has to coincide with the size of object they're looking for. Okay, so it needs to generate a reflection. Now, that object for most bats then is some sort of insect. So they need to produce a small wavelength of sound so that it reflects off a small object. So high frequencies will have these nice small waves, but the problem with them is they attenuate very quickly. So they just don't travel very far. They travel, in some cases, a few meters in front of their face. Whereas the lower the frequencies they can use, the longer distance of those frequencies will travel. And that's great because they can fly faster, for example. So like something like a hoary bat, and I mentioned they're migratory. They're going to fly hundreds, not over 1,000 kilometers. And they need to be kind of moving pretty quickly. They're just a fast flying bat. Their morphology is such that they are a fast flying bat. But just like a car driving at night, you can only drive as fast as your headlights allow you. Same with the bat. Flying at night, they can only fly as fast as their echolocation allows them to. So they have to produce these low frequencies that go way out in front of them so that they can fly fast and not run into something, for example. But because they're producing low frequencies, that means that they're only really going to detect the larger insects. The really small insects, like midges, for example, their low frequency sound waves are going to go right past an insect of that small size. So that's where you get the difference in foraging and what their diet is made of is largely based on what they can actually look for. And that stems back to the frequencies that these bats actually produce. Now, the other thing to know is that the wing beat coincides with the flapping of their wings. So they're going to be producing pulses of these sounds. Okay, and I'll actually show you what that looks like. Here we go. Pulses, excuse me, of sound. So this is actually a what's called a sonogram or spectrogram, and you can see on the left, this is frequency. This is the y-axis, and on the x-axis on the bottom is time. Now this is actually I've put it into what's called compressed time, because I wanted you to see a bunch of pulses, but in reality, there'd be a long amount of time between those pulses of sound. And when I say long, each pulse could be about 2 to 10 milliseconds, but the time between them can be anywhere from 100 milliseconds up to 2 seconds, depending on the species. So there's this pulse of sound that's produced, a bunch of frequencies, and then this long period between the pulses when the bats would actually be, because I'm not going to quiz you on this, so the Y pulses, the reason is to listen for the echoes. So they're producing these pulses of sound, and then they wait and listen for the echo. Then produce another pulse, and they wait, listen for the echo. So this is why bats produce this sonogram looking where we've got pulses of sound separated by time. Is the time between the pulses actually coincides with their wing beats. So this is where I'm saying a big bat will flap and produce, produce sound at the same time because it saves energy. So they flap their wings, and as they go down, the downbeat, automatically they're breathing out, so they're also producing their sound. And so a big bat will have a lot longer time between the pulses when they're listening, versus a small bat, which is flapping faster, will produce a pulse, less listening time, pulse, less listening time. That falls apart a little bit as they get close to an object, where they will actually speed up the production of their sound because they need very quick feedback. As they zero in on an insect, they need to be able to tell exactly where it is, how far away it is. And so that whole wing beat pulse synchronization kind of falls apart at that time. But while they're out searching for prey, that's what's controlling how much time is between the pulses. One thing, just kind of a cool thing that I wanted to mention is that bats scream. So they're spending a lot of energy echolocating, and because it's actually very energy taxing to scream 10 times per second. So they are they're actually having to scream. Most of the bats are doing this. Some bats are much quieter, but a lot of bats are screaming to the point that it's almost, well, it is deafening. It could be deafening to them because it's producing sound out of their mouth that's about 140 decibels. Like we're on the same scale as like a jet engine, for example, or holding a smoke detector going off up to your ear. So what bats have to do is they produce this really loud sound out of their mouth. They actually do have to dampen their ear bones just a little using muscles. They pull them apart and then they can put them back together, and they do that 10 times per second. And they're doing it very, very quickly so that they can listen for the echo. So they produce the sound very loud. That's where they could damage their hearing. So they have the slight disconnect of those middle ear bones, but then they go back together very quickly so that they can listen for the sound. So bring it all together. The ecology of echolocation depends on body size, flight behavior, the sounds that they're actually producing, whether they need to listen for prey-generated sounds like some of the bigger bats. And over time, they have evolved to match their prey. And again, I don't have time to get into that here, but there is some interesting things that have happened over evolutionary time that has allowed this sort of arms race between bats and moths, for example. And moths, some of the moths actually can hear bat ultrasound, and it's kind of cool to have seen how that little war has shaped both insects and bats. You know, actually, just for time, I don't think I'll go through that one because we've actually already talked about all that. But I do want to get into what we call the clutter continuum. So the clutter continuum is really just what do bats do as they fly through their environment and approach objects, whether that be like trees in their way or if it's insects. They do different things with their ultrasound, with their echolocation, because they need certain information to come back to them. And the high frequency sounds allow them to tell a lot more detail about an object than the low frequency sounds. And so they will actually take advantage of that and use a whole range of frequencies. And all bats do that, which means that they all start to kind of do similar things when they approach objects, especially their prey, or if they're in a forest and they're approaching trees. And this really complicates being able to tell species apart because they all start to do similar things. And this is where the tricky part in using acoustics as a tool comes. So in high clutter, all bats will kind of lean towards using what we call steep calls. It means that they're producing a big range of frequencies in a very short period of time. They're making their calls a lot shorter so that they can have the pulse of sound go up very quickly and then listen for that echo to come back. And they're going through a lot of frequencies, using higher frequencies because those are better for resolving the detail and distance, and then raising their frequencies. So this is kind of a visual of how this works. This is a bat that's going to fly towards a tree, and you're going to see how its pulses change in shape. And that means they're changing the frequency and the duration of the pulses. So when the bat's just out in the open flying, it's producing kind of lower frequency calls, longer duration, and now it gets close to the tree and it goes up in frequency. And these pulses are made up of a lot of higher frequencies as well. And then now it's back out in the open, it goes back to just using this more low frequency sounds. Again, sounds that will go far into the distance and allow them to fly a little faster until they detect an object, and boom, then they start to produce a slightly, well, quite different actually, pulse shape where it's very high frequency and steep. This is called the clutter continuum, and this is what complicates being able to tell species apart. Bats respond to any form of clutter. Bats respond to any object that reflects sound back to them. So it's trees, grass, ground, other bats, and so on. So this is just an example of what we would call a search, approach, a buzz, and back to a search. And that buzz is associated with having captured an insect. So they'll get really, really steep, fast calls as they attack an insect. Okay, and finally, the slow bats then. When they tend to forage in high clutter because slow bats are very maneuverable, so they will tend to be in amongst the clutter, and they're pretty tough to tell acoustically because they like to be in amongst clutter, and they can be very quiet because the sound that needs to reflect off the objects doesn't have to travel very far. They don't have to scream. The tree branch may only be a few feet in front of their face, and they're maneuvering through those, so they'll be quiet, and therefore they're actually really hard to record. So that's something that we struggle with when we're recording bats, is quiet bats. You have to, your microphone essentially has to be within a few meters of them before you're going to record some of these species. And then when you do record them, they're responding to something. So they're all going to have this sort of steep call, and then that's going to make it really hard to tell them apart. And I do go through a lot more detail on this in my acoustic courses, but here I'm trying to shorten this, give you a sense at least of what's involved with bat acoustics. So the other extreme, the fast bats out in the open, probably makes sense now based on what I've told you, that they're going to be loud. They're going to have these sort of lower frequency pulses. They're actually going to be long duration pulses, which I won't go into why that is necessarily, but know that they are they're out searching in an area where they don't expect a lot of reflected ultrasound, and as long as they're not getting reflections, then they're producing these kind of low slope, low frequency calls, and those are the ones that are the easiest to tell apart, and that's when we have our best chance of being able to tell the species apart. So how do you record them? There's a whole toolbox, and I don't have time to get into any of these, but just know that there's a lot of different bat detectors out there, and they all do different things. And they've all got different accessories too, and you do need to kind of dive in to understand that. In particular, the microphones. So one thing that there was a misconception out there for the longest time because of an early publication on the Handbook of Echolocation that kind of showed a bat detector with a microphone that kind of looked like a flashlight beam, and that's not actually how microphones work. And this has been fixed in the new publication that's just come out, the Echolocation Handbook. Aaron Fraser is the lead editor of that. You can get that on ResearchGate. But this has been fixed now to where the actual beam from a microphone looks more like this, where you've got this axis that goes out on the center a long ways out, and that's where you detect most of your bats. Good to know these sorts of things because then you know how to place your detectors. So I'm not going to get into any really technical things here, other than just to point out that there's a lot of things you need to know about a bat detector before you go put it out in the landscape. And understanding the microphone is one of them, because you also have to make some decisions about what type of mic. Some are what's called directional, like the one I just showed you, where it points out in front of the microphone itself. But then there's omnidirectional that will actually record out in all directions. And there's pros and cons of each of those. And they record bats differently, and you will have different quality recordings from them as well. And then there's actually new mics on the market now too that will be kind of a combo of both of these. They're not really directional or omnidirectional. Some other technical aspects of recording bats is just the site placement. It has to be well thought out, even right down to like how far away is the nearest point of clutter in terms of feet. You should only be a certain feet or a certain number of meters away from some of these reflective surfaces in order to get good recordings that will allow you to tell species apart. You have to think about sources of noise, reflections, and what will the bat be doing. It's most important to try to make sure that you're recording bats that are not reacting to any form of reflections or clutter. There is a little roadmap that is in the book that I mentioned, the BC Bat book, but this is kind of your best bet at being able to sort of piece together what potential species you might be recording. Different species produce different frequencies, but there's a lot of overlap. You can also look at shapes of calls and so on. There's certain ways you can tell species apart, but not all species can be differentiated with acoustics, and not all of these species then are kind of candidates, I guess, if you will, for acoustic inventory. Bats are not birds. The sounds that they're making are functional. So that means that these bats are out using the sounds that they do because they're feeding on a certain size of insect in a certain context. So bats that are feeding on similar sized insects in similar contexts, like in the forest or out in the open, they're doing things that might be similar to other bats. Similar sized bats eating similar sized insects will often produce very similar echolocation calls, even though they might not be similar bats. So the big brown and the silver-haired, for example, they're very different bats, but they're actually relatively similar sizes, and they feed in similar ways on similar insects. And so these two species are really difficult to tell apart. And a lot of times you just simply say big brown / silver-haired, and you don't differentiate. Now, there are certain bat detectors and certain acoustic programs that now try to auto-identify bats for you, and they're kind of fun, but a lot of times they're wrong because they are just using algorithms in the background to try to piece together what the species might be, and it doesn't know that, that you're standing in front of, let's say, a bat reacting to a tree. It has no sense of context. So if you have that context, and you can like spotlight a bat and you can see the difference, like the big brown looks brown and the silver-haired looks black. You might be able to tell those species apart using that technique, even though their echolocation calls might look the same. So the acoustic analysis that is available on the market today, there are several that will try to auto-identify, and for some species they do pretty good. And especially if those bats have been recorded in a way that allows you to try to tell those species apart. You always have to have caution and make sure that you review these species manually to make sure you just don't blindly accept what they've given you. But as I mentioned, acoustics is not necessarily the thing that allows you to tell all these species are in an area. So inventory, there's a lot of different tools beyond bat detectors that you probably should be using for certain species. Some of that is mist net capture. Some of it is heart trap capture. Again, depends on the scenario and what species you're looking for. You might be radio tracking to find where some of these bats are roosting. You might be using genetics to identify the species or to look at taxonomy. For example, you can get genetic samples from guano, from a wing swab, or from a tissue biopsy. We already talked about what happened to Kenii, so I won't mention that here. But the species-specific inventories that are required in some cases, you need to go out and use a mix of methods if you want to verify certain species is there. Not all species then can be figured out acoustically, and then you go out and you target that species with some capture inventories. So for example, pallid bats, really difficult to tell this species from big brown acoustically. So you would want to go out and put down some very low strung nets in potential flyways to try to capture this species. Spotted bat, actually really easy to tell acoustically, so you might not need to do any kind of capture for them, but if you were going to, it needs to be really tall nets. In fact, this is a quad net, means that there's 4 nets high, and this is the highest net that we know how to set other than canopy nets. But that I did use in Lillooet to capture spotted bats there. The reason we wanted to capture them was to look for reproduction and to track them to find maternity roosts, which we did along the Fraser River. Townsends Bigger Bat is quiet, so you're not necessarily going to record that bat. If you do, it's got a really unique pattern because of its kind of odd-shaped nose, and it does produce echolocation sounds out of its nose. But you can also see this bat if you walk into mines or in abandoned houses and so on. It doesn't tend to hide very well because of its big ears. Okay, the big brown, you can tell sometimes with acoustics, but you can also misnet. Silver-haired, like I said, it's hard to tell from big brown acoustically, so you might want to use a spotlight or misnet to capture them. The nice part about silver-hairs in the winter, we've now discovered that they produce songs. What's down on the bottom right there. And it's a very unique pattern, which allows us now to tell that species because the big browns don't make those sounds, the songs, I should say. Okay, little brown jobbies, for the most part, there's some you can tell apart acoustically, like the long-eared and the fringed myotis, but the rest, you're pretty much going to be stuck misnetting, because you're going to lump them into categories like 40 kilohertz bats. Oh, which one's there? We're going to have to go misnet, or you're going to have to go get genetic samples. And then there's the same thing with the 50 kilohertz bats. There's two species that you can't always tell apart, the California and the Yuma. Okay, and finally, the Lazurans, they are in many cases differentiated through acoustics, which is a good thing because they are quite hard to capture as well. They're fast flying. This is just an example of what the acoustics look for Cori bat and for eastern red bat. All right, the last section I wanted to go through is kind of talking about the risks then, the threats that bats face, and just mentioning a few of the potential things that we could be doing to help them. So increasingly at risk, we've got problems. Oops, that's in there. Mainly, we've got problems with our hibernating species, and that is the white nose syndrome, which is spreading. So you can see here a map of North America that shows that the species, the fungus that causes white nose syndrome is spreading across North America. That fungus kills bats while they hibernate because it grows on cold bodies in these nice cold, moist conditions. The bat continues to arouse throughout the winter more than it should, using up its fat, and it is trying to groom and jumpstart its immune system. So for those of you who don't know, it sort of started here where the X is. At least that was the thought. That's where it was first discovered. New research on the Partiti virus, which is a virus that infects fungi. That species, or sorry, that I can just hear someone, and I realize I'm 11:35. I'm going to try to wrap that up in a few minutes. But this fungus has spread over the last decade into Western North America, but has not spread terribly fast in Washington. So I just wanted to point out here in the West, especially in BC, we don't have the fungus yet that we know of. It is very much present in Washington, where we've now seen mortalities. It has spread into Saskatchewan. As of this summer, it was discovered there. And we're looking for it through guano, some wing swabbing, and carcasses being turned in. Another threat is wind turbines. That is impacting largely our migratory species, but here in BC, we actually have little browns, and is actually a bit of a problem. We think the little browns up in the Northeast BC might be moving long distances seasonally, and therefore they are also being killed by the wind turbines. Believe it or not, invasive species, plants are a problem. The burdock, Fuller's teasel as well. Things that can trap them, pipes, open buckets, troughs, where if they happen to fall in the water, they might not be able to get out if there's no little ladder there. So we encourage people to turn these things upside down, or provide little ladders inside, like a little piece of wood or something, allows them to crawl out. Roadkill, we don't understand how big an impact this is having on bats yet, but it looks like it might not be insignificant. COVID-19 was a bit of a concern. We now wear masks when we handle bats to make sure that we do not transfer that virus into bats. We don't know their susceptibility fully yet, especially Lamosa species, actually. And one that's becoming more obvious as a potential concern is climate change, because we are getting bats that are overheating in bat boxes. And we know that we are having these increasing heat waves. So I won't spend a lot of time on this other than to say that we do need to think about how we position our bat boxes. And this is where some of those webinars I've given in the past that you could search on YouTube might provide you with some of that information as to what we should be doing with bat boxes to make sure that they don't overheat. And I'm just going to skip ahead on this section, just like I mentioned, as we get to the end here. I want to make sure we allow time for questions. So yeah, and this is stuff I do cover in the webinar, so I don't think I'll go into that here. Goldilocks approach, you can, like I said, visit a couple of these webinars in YouTube if you like. I also have an article that just came out in the Bat Conservation Trust called the Goldilocks approach. And that is freely available. You don't have to be a member to access that particular issue. They put it out for COP26. Okay, and finally, what we're doing. So here's where I think I'll just kind of really just point out our projects, but then leave it at that. Because if you want to know more about what we're doing with Wildlife Conservation Society, you can go to the website that I'll give at the very end. But we are looking at bat box guidance. We developed a BMP. Okay, so bat box monitoring. We've got programs like Bat Caver, Winter Ecology and Physiology research, North American Bat Monitoring Program. I'll just skip ahead to that one. Here we go, Bat Caver, survivorship in winter, North American Bat Monitoring Program. We're doing a lot of research like understanding migration routes. And we're spending a ton of time on a treatment for white nose syndrome, which we are piloting now in Washington. We've been doing it for a few years in BC. It's a probiotic that we apply into the roosts, and the bats incorporate some naturally occurring soil microbes that will help them fight off that fungus in the winter. And so we're working with a variety of universities, particularly Thompson Rivers University, McMaster, on that probiotic. I think that might be, yeah, this is the last one. So this is the last thing that we're doing, is really enhancing habitats. We're trying to understand how we can use something other than bat boxes, because bat boxes only appeal to some species. And what we're worried is that if bat boxes were to be put up in places that there's not already a colony, we might be influencing the natural community of bats. So in places where you're doing an eviction, for example, bat boxes are completely appropriate. The more, the better, to give them choice, so that they don't, they can find some cool boxes and hot boxes, and not overheat. Have something for spring, for summer, and for fall. But that's only if you're evicting bats. And if you are not, in these kind of areas where there's not maybe already big colonies of building roosting bats, we're trying to appeal by putting up different types of tree roost enhancements, so that other species can benefit from our roost enhancement artificial type of structure. So that's branded bark, which is fake bark, or just creating snags with strategic chainsaw cuts in them that would give places for bats to hide in trees during the day. All right, I'll end on this, which is just other resources that you can go to if you want to learn more about some of these things, our programs, acoustics, and some general information. And that does leave us 20 minutes. I hope that's going to be enough. So yeah, questions.
Thank you so much, Cori. That was a lot of great information in the short period of time.
I know. I warned you.
But all great. That opened the door if people want to know more on the specific details. But yeah, we did get some questions, so I can jump right into it. So first, we have a question from Karen. Is there any information on how bats use estuarine habitat?
Oh, well, not really. I mean, there's been observations of bats, definitely, and I personally have seen a lot of bats in those areas, and they do seem to, even out onto the ocean, they do seem to be skimming very low, especially the little brown and Yuma Myotis. And at times it almost looks like they're drinking, but they're not. We don't think they would necessarily be consuming salt water, that's for sure. But they are picking insects probably off the surface of the water, and so that way they can be out over salty water and just foraging. But they would have to go find fresh water to actually drink.
Awesome, thank you. And the next question from Bruce: have there been any accounts of bats suffering from blue-green algae toxins in some stagnant ponds subject to blooms?
We think so. Yeah, there is some published literature on that. So yes, and here in BC, we think it has happened. There's been sort of undocumented cases of it, like in that Metro Vancouver area. There was also what we think might have been that in Creston area 2 years ago, I believe it was. There was some mass mortalities at our condo, and the water was very low and was certainly looked like there was algae problems just because of the dry year. So anecdotally, yes, in BC, but definitely there is some published literature outside of BC that does show that can cause die-offs in bats. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And then, yeah, I think we have some participants kind of just chatting in the chat box as well on some of the tools that people can use for testing water quality and algae specific issues. So next, we did have some questions about climate change, but you touched on it. If we have time, we can come back to it and talk about it more. But next question, we did receive two very similar questions about what can we do to better protect bats with urbanization and loss of bat habitat. Seems that many municipal planning agencies and developers are not aware of the value and presence of bats in the urban setting.
It's so true, that's something I think the community bat programs are doing a very good job of, and I think that will continue to improve. But getting that message out to urban planners, for example, to try to make sure that we keep these green spaces available for foraging, that we have available open water to bats, like ponds, and offering the appropriate roost options. So the more options there are, the better for the bats to actually survive and have young, but also the better chance that you're going to attract a bigger diversity of bats. I mean, bats, like, I don't know if I mentioned this, but they represent almost 20% of small mammal diversity in the province. And our urban centers don't necessarily have very high diversity, especially if they are not thinking about how to incorporate roost and foraging habitats within the city boundaries. And it can be done, especially with parks, these green spaces that people like, also bats can use. It might require some artificial roosts. And what I think is, completely acceptable is to put in things like bat boxes and bat condos, which are the bigger structures that bats can roost in. In these urban environments, it's fine because we typically do find these large clusters of building roosting bats anyways, and over time, they are losing habitat because buildings are just being replaced. These older buildings are collapsing, newer energy efficient, tight sealed buildings are going up. And so there's less and less habitat for bats to roost in, and they are philopatric, and they're going back. And they're coming back to, let's say, the house that they were born in, and they've been doing it for 30 years, and they come back in the spring and, they've either been excluded or that building's gone. And then what do? So having these structures within these urban environments kind of guarantees that they're going to have a place to go raise young. And so, yeah, there are other species that they could be appealing to other than bats that roost in buildings, by including things like Brandon bark, or making sure that there's old mature trees that are in our urban environments. The rock roosting ones are a little bit harder to try to appeal to. We don't really have any artificial structures that we're using for that right now, but bridges have seemed to have filled that niche for some species. Concrete bridges.
Thank you so much. There was a question from Peter. Is there interference between bats when you're doing the echolocating?
Oh, you mean like when they're next to each other and they're echolocating? Is that what he means? Probably. I don't see the question here. Can you read the question?
Yeah, for sure. Peter, if you want to unmute yourself and elaborate more as well, but I'm assuming is that if there's presence of multiple bats, would that interfere with your?
Okay.
Yes, when they're interacting, when they're foraging together in the same area.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is yes, especially if they're the same species, because they're going to be producing the same frequencies, or very similar to the same frequencies. So we get what's called frequency spreading. This is not well understood, and it seems to differ between the species, but basically if bats are too close to each other, then they're going to be interfering with each other, with the sounds they're producing, and then hearing their echoes. And so they will actually shift. This is kind of one of those interesting mysteries. We don't know how they decide who does this, but one bat will often take a higher frequency and the other one will take a lower. And so then they split that way so that they're producing slightly different frequencies, and then they recognize their own echoes when it comes back. But that adds to the difficulty in trying to identify bats as well, because they get near each other and they start adjusting their echolocation calls. And particularly see each other's clutter too. They don't want to run into each other. So.
Thank you, Cori and Peter. Another question from Mark. Other than bats spreading the white nose fungus, how is it spread? specifically, are people a vector?
Other than bats spreading the white nose fungus, how's it spread? Oh, well, it's not really clear as to how the white nose fungus is spreading. Like the bats are definitely spreading it themselves. So they are transferring the spores to each other, maybe during mating, definitely during hibernation. And this might even be occurring in the summer a little bit, now that we're finding out more and more about the fact that these spores can survive under bridges, at these night roosts. That's something that was just recently discovered in Montana and Saskatchewan. And so the bats are definitely spreading it amongst themselves. People could potentially spread it. For the longest time, they thought maybe cavers would be spreading it from cave to cave. That might have occurred a little bit, but there's been no evidence of that, concrete evidence of it. It could be like, on clothing or in mud of boots, but the bats would have to come in contact with those spores afterwards for that to be a way to spread it. So the more likely avenue, if it's going to be spread by humans, is going to be by bat researchers themselves, because they're the ones that are handling the bats. And if they don't properly decontaminate or use a different set of gear when they go to another cave, then they could introduce the spores to the bats that they're handling. So that's, that led to a whole series of decontamination protocols that bat researchers now have to go through. And in many cases, we're also keeping our equipment separate. So equipment that gets used in areas where the fungus is, that equipment doesn't come over to an area where the fungus is not yet. So that's helped.
Thank you, Cori. Yeah, we have a lot of questions coming in. So I think I will kind of lump some together. So we have received some questions on the impacts of different impacts on bats. So what are some, so we have seen increased forest fires in BC, and how is it affecting the bat population?
Such a good question. And this is something that's quickly rising to the top of knowledge gaps and urgency to figure this out, because in the long run, some of these snags that are produced might benefit bats, but in the short term, bats are probably dying from these forest fires. And then it's not clear as to how this is impacting their roosting habitat. It's bound to appeal to some species more than others. Obviously, species that are using foliage, if an area is just completely burned out and these trees are now dead, those foliage roosting species aren't going to be there. But could that have opened it up to different types of bats, and that could use those types of snags? So I think it's going to ultimately be changing the community makeup of these areas that are burned. Probably there are actually bats dying during this process. I know I do hear anecdotal reports of firefighters saying they're seeing bats fleeing out of these trees as the trees are being lapped up in flames, and how many of those actually survive. But this is unfortunately something we really don't have a lot of data on yet. So big research gap.
Thank you. And then to tie on the other aspect of it is, how critical is the loss of a wetland through development contribute to a local bat population? Well,
it could be huge. And that's because there are, like I said, certain species like Yuma Myotis and little brown that tend to be very highly associated with wetlands, because they do feed on a lot of aquatic insects during their skimming. So if that foraging and drinking habitat disappears, those species, those bats in that population are going to be impacted. And what we don't fully understand, and it probably depends on the context, it would depend on the context, as to whether they have a slow die-off, because some of the research that's happened down in the Southwest US, for example, they would purposely cover up bodies of water with tarps to see how females would respond. So if the water disappeared, would they move to a different roost closer to where there is water? And it turned out they didn't. They actually stayed put in the roost that they knew that they have been going to for many years. But they had to fly a lot further now to get water. And so they probably couldn't produce enough milk, because they were finding that, the females, by traveling further and not having a good source of food and water right next to their roosts, would lower their reproductive success. So it might just be over time that population starts to dwindle. You're not going to notice it right away, and that's the unfortunate part. It's fortunate that bats live a long time, but it's also unfortunate in a way that we don't see the immediate effects of some of our landscape changes, because these are long-lived mammals. So you might still have bats in the area for a long time, decades even, but without much replacement if they're not really reproducing anymore. And so it's this slow decline that may not be all that noticeable. And then in 10, 20 years, there are no bats in that area anymore because they haven't been able to raise young. But they've made a living by, flying longer distances to try to get food and water, but remaining in some of their long-term roosts that they typically use.
Thank you. Thank you, Cori. And next question from Jordan. When looking at conservation of pallid bats, is looking at what types of plants they use as nectar a consideration, or is it too small a part of their diet to matter?
Oh, that we don't know. Like literally this is just within recent years, last few years, that it's been discovered that these bats even feed on nectar. So it's probably not a huge component of their diet. But yeah, we don't know. And especially in BC, we don't know if it's a part of their diet at all. But I think it would be interesting to try to understand that, especially in the Okanagan, because if they are using some of the native plants, for example, it might be that there's a low level of pollination that's happening from them too, for all we know. So again, these native plants might be benefiting from pallid bats. So it's at this point we just don't know anything about it really, but it certainly has opened up this whole new way of looking at pallids and thinking about how they interact with the plants in their environment.
Thank you. A question from Rebecca. What is the purpose for bats roosting together? Is it to share warmth while their body temperatures are low?
That's a really good question. Generally, yes. I mean, there's multiple reasons for bats to roost together, and like I said, not all species do it, and in fact, many don't. And it's good that that's the case, because it means that they're all selecting slightly different roost types. They're not all competing for the same type of roost. So in a forest, you've got like tiny little gaps under bark where like a California Myotis could roost up under that, and they don't mind roosting alone, or just in a couple of bats, females come together. But that's because they choose such a tiny little spot to roost that they kind of take over their own microenvironment. So it's like like putting on a blanket over yourself. Like you can get really warm because you're trapping that air, and bats are also going to kind of increase the humidity of their little microenvironment in their roost and not dry out. So they choose a small bat that's going to roost alone is going to choose a really small spot so that they can kind of contain their own heat and moisture for the day. Now, the other strategy though is to get together with a lot of other individuals, and then you can kind of almost control your microenvironment. They can go into anything. They can go into a big open attic. They could go into a big hollow tree, but they're roosting together as a group, so they're going to huddle and keep each other warm. And moist as well, like keep that dehydration minimal. But there's also the social component that we're sure exists, that they get together in these clusters also behaviorally. For example, pup sitting. So we see this a lot with some of our building roosting colonies where there's been, they're easier to study, and it looks like there are always sort of adult females that are staying with the pups, and they almost rotate out to do some foraging, and then they swap out those pup sitting duties. And so there's probably that component of communal pup raising that is happening. We do know, I've personally through radio tracking discovered that some females even nurse other females' pups. They end up looking after each other's pups, even to the point of nursing them or moving them. And it doesn't mean that they're related. In fact, many cases, these females are not necessarily related to each other. So that's also interesting because it's not necessarily kin-based.
Thank you, Cori. I notice we are almost out of time. So there are still a couple of questions, but I think I'll save this one for the last one as like a general takeaway. You kind of mentioned some resource about the roosting habitats. Sorry, I just lost the question here. So in general, do you have, I guess, any good suggestions for bat-friendly designs and infrastructure? So for example, materials used for bridges, gazebos, things like that.
Well, bridges definitely. Bats, you can sometimes find bats under bridges that are made of steel if the steel is very rusted. Bats try to use those structures, but they definitely benefit from concrete, basically simulating a rock overhang or a cave roost. So the concrete is better. So for bridges, having that open girder, like T shaped bridge design with concrete is really much better for bats than any of the concrete or sorry the steel designs, and especially not wood creosote. Bats do, thank gosh, seem to avoid the creosote, and they do actually avoid treated wood in many cases. So that's also something to think about, when you're making structures for them, to use as raw wood as possible, even avoiding plywood. We don't know why bat boxes that are brand new and condos that are brand new sometimes don't get used for sometimes many years. We don't know if that's a behavioral thing or if that's related to something with chemicals like gassing off of plywood, for example. So again, trying to use as raw materials as possible might help bats start using those structures, but also just be healthier for them.
Thank you so much, Cori. Yeah, I think we're nearing the time. So I just want to thank you once again, Cori. We've got lots of great comments about your presentation, and a lot of people have learned so many new things about bats today. So thank you again. Yeah, is there anything you want to say last, or Alyssa, did you want to close it up?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind everybody about the evaluation. I've just put the link in the chat, but it's quickly getting drowned out by everybody's congratulations to Cori for giving such a great informative presentation, and many thanks. So if you can take the time to fill out that evaluation form, it'll take about 5 minutes, shouldn't take more than that, and you will be entered into a draw to win a BCWF prize.
All right, if there is no last word, so I just want to thank you once again and enjoy your afternoon and have a great weekend, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your interest.
Thank you, Cori. Thank you everybody for joining today. Cindy, did you want to remove everybody and then we could just have a quick chat about the